relating to verse 20 in chapter 5. The rest of Matthew gives us 6 examples that contrast the false righteousness of the Pharisees with the true surpassing righteousness. And all 6 of these examples that Jesus gives is to correct the narrow and warped understandings of the Old Testament law. Jesus upheld the authority of the Old Testament, but he opposed the misguided interpretations of the scribes. They had unwritten laws. Many of those that became an oral tradition. And they were opinions that learned rabbis had collected through the years. Now, Jesus introduced a deeper understanding, a righteousness that exceeded that of the Pharisees as he taught. So he said that he came to give full meaning to the law and to what the prophets had said. We're going to begin with murder. In verse 21 of chapter 5 of Matthew, Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment.'" Here Jesus quoted the 6th of the 10 commandments that are listed in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 5. He said, "Do not murder." Now, a person who committed murder was subject to judgment. That means that they would be subject to a trial, and their case, if it had to do with murder, which it did, would be punishable by death. Now, the 10 Commandments didn't mention this judgment, but Jesus, or the Jewish teachers, combined Numbers 35:30 with the commandment itself, "Do not murder." And that verse reads, "Anyone who kills a person is to be put to death as a murderer on the testimony of witnesses." Plural. Witnesses is plural, not just one witness. So the accepted view in Jesus' time was that the people could think of themselves as keeping the law if they didn't actually kill someone. But in verse 22, the first part of verse 22, Jesus begins to give a fuller meaning of that law. He said, "But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment." Now first, let's realize who our brother is. Jesus is really referring to all human beings. It isn't necessarily, brother isn't necessarily our relative. It's not necessarily a brother in Christ. It is everyone that he is speaking to here. And Jesus demands more than outward obedience of the law. He demands an inner righteousness and purity which can't be judged in a court of law. The law of Moses said, "Do not murder." But Jesus taught that we shouldn't even become angry enough to want to murder someone. The Pharisees never murdered anyone. So they felt that they had obeyed the law. But we know they were angry enough with Jesus that they plotted to kill him. And of course, we know they didn't do the dirty work themselves when it came to killing Jesus. But they were just as guilty. You see, in God's eyes, it isn't only the person who committed murder who's guilty. The person who is angry with another is also guilty and subject to judgment. We miss the intent of God's Word when we just read His rules for living without trying to understand why He made them. There was a reason behind every one of these. Now, in the second part of verse 22, Jesus links murder with contempt. He said, again, anyone who says to his brother, Raka, is answerable to the Sanhedrin. Now, Raka is an Aramaic word which means stupid or empty head. And you could probably add some other names along with that. It's a word of contempt. And it comes from pride. There's a story about a rabbi, Simon ben Eleazar, who was coming from his teacher's house one day, and he was feeling so pleased with himself about his learning and about how good he was. And along the way, he met another man, and that man was kind of a plain-looking person, but the man spoke to the rabbi, and the rabbi said back to him, "You Raka, how ugly you are. Are all of the men in your town as ugly as you?" And the man rebuked the rabbi and said, "I don't know. Go and tell the master, the maker, who created me, how ugly I am." Jesus said that contempt is subject to judgment by the Sanhedrin. That was the Jewish Supreme Court at that time. The sin of contempt comes from our being proud. Sometimes we can be proud about who we are to a point that we brag about it and think everybody else, it doesn't matter who they are. Doesn't matter. But where we are from matters. We also might think and be proud of our education. And that these things are not really bad in themselves, but it's when we flaunt them, we brag about them. Or it might be our financial status. It may be the things we own. It may be the way we dress, or the makeup we put on, or whatever that makes us proud. But we must never look with contempt on any person for whom Christ died. And who is that? Everybody. Yes. Now, the last part of verse 22, Jesus said, "But anyone who says, 'You fool,' will be in danger of the fire of hell." Now, "you fool," in the Greek, is the word moros, and that's the person who is a moral fool. William Barclay describes the moral fool as a man who lived an immoral life and who, in wishful thinking, said there was no God. To call a person, "you fool," wasn't criticizing their mental ability. It was attacking and harming their reputation. and it branded the person as living an immoral life. Jesus said, anyone who says, "You fool," will be in the danger of hellfire. Or the fire of hell. Jesus is talking about the ultimate judgment. In the Greek, this is talks about the fire of Gehenna. This was a place that the Jews called the Valley of Hinnom. It was an actual place. It was a place where King Ahaz had introduced Israel to the fire worship of the heathen god Molech. And of course, if we remember from back in January, when I preached about that, little children were burned in the fire. They were sacrificed to Molech. But when Josiah became king, he shut that down. There was no more of that sacrificing of children and worshiping an idol. But it became a place that the trash from Jerusalem was taken and burned. William Barclay describes it like this: it was a kind of public incinerator. The fire smoldered in it, and a pall of thick smoke lay over it, and it bred a loathsome kind of worm which was hard to kill. It became identified in people's minds with all that was accursed and filthy, as the place where useless and evil things were destroyed. That is why it became a synonym for the place of God's destroying power, for hell. Jesus is saying that the worst thing of all is to destroy a person's reputation, and that such conduct is hell-deserving sin. Now, folks, when I see hell described in the Bible, and especially as Jesus calls it here, it's not a place I want to be, and it's not a place any of you want to be. Because Millard Erickson wrote that hell is the absence of God. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm certainly glad that God is not absent in my life, and I pray that there's no one here this morning that God is not in their life. Jesus taught about the sacredness of life. And He taught that we should act against anger rather than to act against the person who angers us. Now, beginning in verses 23 and 24, Jesus has some illustrations, a couple illustrations, and they have to do with the importance of mending broken relationships. In verses 23 and 24, Jesus said, "Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift." When we remember that we have wronged someone, we need to seek their forgiveness. And we need to try to restore a relationship with them. Jesus said, this is so very important that you should stop what you're doing, even worshiping, and go and be reconciled with the person or persons that you may have wronged. Why? Folks, it is because we cannot truly worship God while being at odds with someone. For you see, our sin against others is also a sin against God. And sin hinders our relationship with God, and it hinders our worship of God. That's why Jesus said, stop your worshiping and take care of that problem, that need. In verses 25 and 26, Jesus gives another illustration about reconciliation. Jesus said, settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still with him on the way, or he may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. I tell you the truth. You will not get out until you have paid the last penny. In Jesus' day, if you couldn't pay a debt, then you were thrown into prison until it was paid. It makes you wonder, how do they expect you to pay if you're in prison and you can't work? I always wondered about that with prisoners at the Franklin County Regional Jail and other places that couldn't pay their child support, But here they were in jail. They weren't going to be able to work. But anyway, in Jesus' day, if you didn't pay the debt, if someone didn't pay it for you, then you might just live the rest of your life in jail. Now, Jesus' advice here is similar to what Solomon gave us in Proverbs 25. He wrote, don't be in a hurry to go to court, for what will you do in the end if your neighbor deals you a shameful defeat? And that shameful defeat may mean being thrown into prison until the matter is settled. Now, even if we're not taken to court, small conflicts are more easily mended if we make peace right away. Jesus wants us to understand that we are all on the way to court, God's court. So, folks, we need to settle our differences in this life, because reconciliation shows a right relationship with God. It shows our righteousness. Now, we may be able to fake Christianity among some people. But folks, we cannot fake it with God. He knows all. So here is how we enter the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, we can't make ourselves righteous. There's nothing we can do. We can't be good enough to save ourselves. But Jesus can make us righteous. And we are made righteous when we come to Him, confessing our sin and asking Him to forgive us and to come into our lives and give us direction that will help us to live righteous lives. Jesus died for our sin. He took our place. And He was placed in a tomb. But on the third day, He arose. He is alive. And He is with His Father in heaven right now. And He is there to speak up for us, to intercede for us, to vouch for us. That because we have trusted in Him, we are righteous. May we be much more righteous than the scribes and the Pharisees. And may we all meet together in heaven someday.